So I labeled this part one, a Bayesian analysis of early shamanic origin stories, part one, the historicity of the Buddha, because I realized a couple months ago that I can't do it full justice to analyze, Ajvaikism, Jainism, and Buddhism. I talk about it a little bit, but really the model and the methodology is what I'm focused on here. So it's a Bayesian analysis of early shamanic origin stories. We're going to talk about the historicity of the Buddha today, or shut up, John, don't make me do math, is what Francesca likes to say. So when I sent this to her and she graciously read it. Okay, so why, right? Why are we looking at this? In my some of you know, I'm also taking theological studies classes and Bible studies, and I learned pretty early on how my own lens has been shaped by my own Judeo-Christian upbringing. And I was never really that religious. I grew up Episcopalian, I think, so my dad could play softball for the Christchurch Camels. That was kind of like the extent of it. And, I was raised in a pretty liberal religious household, but we always grew up with the stories of the Greek myths. We always grew up with, my mom was always, myth was around. So I kind of grew up in this, very progressively religious household. We still went to church. But I noticed when I was reading these, basically South Asian religious stories, I kept coming back, trying to connect dots that weren't there with similarities in the Judeo-Christian background. So what I realized is that when we look at historical events, especially legendary figures, we have this inherent confirmation bias that unless we're really, really specific about targeting, we'll never notice, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of, right? And good epistemology is good epistemology. We don't get to pick and choose when we're critical about things. It doesn't necessarily mean that we go around telling people they're wrong, but if we want to be analytical, if we want to be critical, and if we want to advance scholarship, we have to apply that to everything, even the stuff we really care about.
Could you adjust your screen so they can see?
Oh, hey guys. So anyway, the impetus for this came from a scholar named Richard Carrier, who's written two books. One's called Proving History, Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus, and then On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt. What he did was he took the methodology that I'm going to present and defend here and applied it to, as the title suggests, the historicity of Jesus. That is not a can of worms I'm going to open up tonight, but we'll allude to it, right? So, and anyway, what is it, right? This is what it looks like. And I know we're all here because we exactly did not want to have anything to do with that after high school. I was the same way. It's not that bad, right? So roll with me for a second. Basically what it is this is it kind of distilled, and this is from Richard Carrier. It's the probability that our explanation is true with all these other factors. And it's times it's true divided by the times it's true plus the times it's false, right? So let's do a little thought experiment. Let's get away from South Asia for a second. Let's participate. I have a broken car window. Somebody tell me how that might have happened. Baseball. What else? Someone tried to break in. What else? Rock. Car accident. Which one's more likely? We don't know, right? Okay. Let's say I'm parked next to a baseball field. What happens? What happens to our analysis of what's going on? What's more likely now? It's definitely a baseball. Okay, well, I found a rock in my window. Now what happens? We don't know. What we do in Bayes' theorem is we take two hypotheses. One we're trying to investigate, and the other essentially the opposite. So in this case, the historicity of the Buddha, right? And we say, based on the background knowledge that we have about everything, that like, okay, baseballs break windows, right? It wasn't a paper airplane. And based on the evidence that we have, there's a baseball in my car, we're by a little league field. That evidence best explains our hypothesis that a baseball broke the window, right? Now, it's really easy when a baseball breaks the window. It's less easy when we deal with people that may or may not have lived 2,500 years ago. That's when this stuff gets wonky. So the first thing we have to do is establish a criterion of minimal historicity. And I do this because in recent scholarship, this has kind of come up a little bit. And the main defenders of the historicity of the Buddha, the arguments tend to break down to, okay, well, there was somebody, or there was an impetus for it, or maybe he wasn't all of this stuff and it was he was a peasant. And no, let's figure out who the Buddha was before we start arguing about him. And then we can argue, right? We'll get there, I promise. So someone with the name Siddhartha Gautama was born into a royal lineage. These are all important facets of the story, right? Siddhartha left his protected, insulated life as a prince and saw that all life is suffering, whether he went on the path or whether he was just aware of it, or that's sort of unconsequential to the core of it. And then after some trial and error, he meditated under a tree, found success and fulfillment, taught, and died, right? That's the cliff notes of the Buddha story. There's obviously a lot more to it, but if we can kind of analyze this stuff and figure out that, yeah, all of this is pretty true, then okay, great. So now what do? We have to determine a prior probability. That's the first thing. That's what this P of H given B, that's a mathematical way of saying the prior probability, which is before we introduce any sort of Buddha specific evidence, what are we dealing with, right? What is the likelihood that any of these guys existed? So there's a formula, a scale, a criterion, whatever you want to call it, developed by Otto Rank and Lord Raglan a while ago. It's very Joseph Campbellian. It traces like the story of myth and these common mythotypes that show up a lot, right? And the hero's mother is a virgin. Obviously, Jesus is one of those. His father's a king. Jesus is the son of God. So we can go through all of these and pick out and part and parcel these historical figures and figure it out. But what happened was Richard Carrier, in his analysis on the historicity of Jesus, realized that any figure who gets 11 of these, so about half, or at least half, every single one of them has been euhemerized with, we're going to put Jesus to the side for now, because again, that can of worms is euhemerized. Euhemerus was a writer of antiquity that what he did was basically invented legends, wrote them into history, and saw which ones made it into the historical canon. A lot of them did. A lot of these figures, in fact, every single one of them, Jason Chimera was real, but Bellerophon fought the Chimera. So if you're a fan of early 2000s Southeast Division ice hockey, we'll put that in there. You know, every single one of these people, with, again, we'll table Jesus, but has been at one point in time thought to be a real historical character and later revealed to just have been written into history. Some of them are more mythical than others. We see the Buddha scores a 13, right? That's on the cusp, but it's enough for some sort of, you know, give and take here. So 11 is our minimum. Every single one of these 15 people has at least made a plausible argument that they were mythical before they were written into history. So this is what our reference class is. Now, this is where the first little bit of math comes in, okay? So when we're coming up with these calculations, we have to come up with two numbers, one on the high end and one on the low end. The fancy name for the high end is a fortiori, which is the benefit of the doubt. And the fancy name for the low end is a judicentiori, which is like pretty much what I really think. But anyway, we have to be able, because it's history and there's a lot of ambiguity, we have to give at least a very, very high end. Like if I want to do math and say that aliens probably didn't break into my car, I could say there's a 1 in 10 chance that an alien didn't break into my car. We all know that there's probably greater than a 1 in 10 chance, but for argument's sake, that's essentially what this number is. So a fortiori, on the high end, we can count Jesus as a historical figure, right? And then because the most pushback I got from this was the Christian characters, we'll just go ahead and count Moses and Joseph. And this is not Joseph's dad. This is not Jesus's dad. This is the Joseph from the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And so since we gave 2 to the Judeo-Christian, we'll give 2 to the pagans. Which 2 doesn't matter because it's math, but it's my thesis. So we'll count Dionysus because you all probably want wine right now, and Theseus because I like the Minotaur story, right? So that's 5 people in this reference class that we think maybe could have existed. If you can plausibly convince me that more than 5 of these people actually existed, go for it. I mean, if you want to tell me Oedipus existed, you know, shoot your eye out, whatever. But like 5, I think, is a general good high-end number. We do the math. We use Laplace's law of succession, which comes to a prior probability. If you hit this scale, if you score enough, a figure in antiquity, on the high end, there's a 35.2 chance you were real. And on the low end, there's a 5.8% chance this is real. Now, this is not evidence that the Buddha or any of these figures aren't real. This is just a starting point, right? And to hit that point home, a modern version of a prior probability is this thing that ESPN calls the win probability. This is from Super Bowl 51 with 5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. The Atlanta Falcons had a 99.6% chance of winning that football game. Guess who didn't win that football game, right? So it was the worst day of my sports life. And Just because somebody has a 99.6% prior chance of happening doesn't mean that's going to happen. We still have to look at the individual evidence that has to do with the subject matter we're talking about, right? So just in summary, it's an empirical way of deductively and mathematically assigning values to our own confirmation bias. Because if we don't use the math, we're never going to do that. We're just going to brush off other things. So we have two kinds of evidence for figures in antiquity, and this generally goes for everything. Textual, archaeological. There's more in this, just for this quick PowerPoint. I'm going to talk about a couple. So, and again, the numbers I'm about to give you guys don't necessarily matter all that much. What I'm presenting more is the methodology. What I would like for people to take from this is people who know way more about this stuff. And I mean, I know enough Sanskrit to get myself in trouble and nowhere near enough to get myself out of it. So maybe that's what's happening here. But, you know, to take the methodology, use your own numbers, use your own findings, plug it into that formula. It's not that hard. They have apps for it, and start the conversation that way. But anyway, we have textual evidence, which is heavily mythologized, very late. Even the early texts are pretty late. It's not reliable as history, and attempts to date the life of the Buddha result in a very wide range. Archaeological evidence, which kind of counts as textual evidence because it's epigraphical, you know, it's their inscriptions. We have the 29 and then some pillars of Ashoka, maybe, and the Pipraha relics, which are the bones of the Buddha, which was the subject of a pretty cheesily terrible National Geographic documentary with bad music and terrible interviews. Anyway, so let's talk about the text first, right? The main argument for the reliability of these early Buddhist texts, and this comes from mostly Sujato and Brahmali, who say that these early Buddhist texts, which are not biographical, by the way, the biographies, the Buddha Charita and on up are like 700 years after the purported life of the Buddha, maybe, and that's being generous. So we're talking about these texts that were supposedly spoken by the Buddha, translated in an oral tradition, and then finally written down maybe sometime around the 1st century BC. It's just impossible to date. There's two issues here. One, once a text gets written down, it's simply no longer oral. That's just the case, right? We don't know the accuracy of these orally transmitted texts. There's just no way to go back in time and do it. I think Max Muller tried to make the argument for the Rig Veda that he sat down and listened to 3 different recensions and they were all word for word perfect. Like, dude, no, you didn't. That just doesn't happen, right? Like, you're not going to sit there, listen to that voluminous work and catch every little idiosyncratic difference. And even Witzel, who's a scholar of a lot of South Asian, works, has pointed out there's different recensions of the Rig Veda floating around. So it's not necessarily as accurate as we think, even though it very well could be. We just don't know. The second thing is we don't have any written down anything in South Asian literature until these edicts of Ashoka. So that puts away the evidence that we can expect to have, right? We can't say, well, we don't have a biography of the Buddha because there's biographies of everybody else, because there's not biographies of anybody else. That really puts us in a pickle here. So all we have are these kind of facts that get distilled that scholars think indicate humanism, right? So the argument is that the Buddha, if we made the Buddha up, if he was mythologized, then there wouldn't be all of these details, such as the Buddha teaching Pasanati how to lose weight. And these are mostly from the Pali Canon. The Buddha dying of bloody diarrhea, the Buddha claiming to enjoy going to the toilet, the Buddha sleeping on a pile of leaves in the winter, and the Buddha washing his own feet. This argument has been made by many people that, well, he's probably real because these happened, right? Okay, so how do we test this in a Bayesian manner? What we have to do is say, is this stuff, all of this evidence, is that as likely with mythical figures as it is as a quasi-realistic character? I was expecting to have to comb through the literature to find examples of all of these, and you don't. So let's find humanistic elements in other South Asian texts. The most obvious one to me is Yudhishthira has a gambling problem in the Mahabharata, right? Nobody that I know of is claiming that Yudhishthira was real, but using this argument, you could say, well, why would they make up a king that has a gambling problem, right? So that's a very humanistic element in a mythical text. Rama succumbs to the pressure of his subjects and forces Sita to jump on a funeral pyre because he doesn't trust her, because she lived with another guy forever. She was kidnapped. It's very unfair to Sita, but that's the story that Rama says. She doesn't have a voice in this. And I didn't put it up there for some reason, but there's almost a completely analogous story in the Pali Canon where the Buddhist subjects convince him to go, the Brahmins down the street are being too loud or whatever, and he has to go shut them up. And he's listening to his subjects in this, and he's affected by that, right? Krishna stealing the butter, you could, I've seen arguments that why would we have that? I know Guy Beck, speaking of the Sonic theology, makes the point that Krishna, he thinks he existed, but there's just not a ton of evidence for that. And then we have humanistic elements in other traditions, right? It's not just the South Asian tradition that we need to look at. Jacob sleeping on a rock for a pillow. I mean, that's completely analogous to the Buddha sleeping on a pile of leaves in the winter. I don't think Jacob actually built a ladder to heaven. If you want to make the argument empirically that he did that, go for it. But until then, we're just going to assume that that's a literary device. There's a couple Jesus examples in there. And again, I use those not under the assumption that Jesus was a euhemerized or mythical figure, but because the gospel details contradict each other so much that some of these details have to be true in one gospel and untrue in the other, because they just both can't be historically true, including the crucifixion of Jesus, which if it happened as it was told, which most scholars think that that's a literary invention based on how it closely resembled the Passover ceremony, some of the nomenclatures, the timing of it. That argument from embarrassment that why would you have your hero die such a gruesome death? It has literary significance, not just historical significance. And there's even real characters like George Washington. I'm not saying George Washington was real. He was obviously real. But one of the most humanistic parts of the George Washington story, the cherry tree, right? We all know that story. He cut down the cherry tree. His dad confronts him about it. He says, "My bad, you're right. I can't tell a lie." That's a myth. That's made up. So even in the characters that we know were real, these human elements can very, very possibly made up. And that was 200 years ago. And if that has 200, 300, 400 years of being able to turn into some sort of like legend, this stuff definitely after 2,500 or so years has that. The other one is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. I put that in there. I don't know if anybody's read the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It's not the Gnostic text like what some people think is Q. It's basically Jesus. He's an asshole as a little kid, right? He goes around killing teachers he doesn't like that don't teach him the alphabet correctly. Like, you guys think we're hard on those evaluations? Like, Infancy Gospel of Thomas, little Jesus kills you. So nobody's arguing that little Jesus went around and killed the teachers, even though we could say that, like, why would we write that into the story if that really happened? So, and this brings us to this thing called the great man theory. And I'm not going to try to dismantle the patriarchy here, but this is basically the idea. It's attributed to Thomas Carlyle in the 1840s that all good ideas have to come from this like DNA stock of intelligent men, right? And it kind of boils down to these arguments that like, well, if nobody came up with this, who did? And my only response to that, and I think the only one it really needs, is who invented Vedic Brahmanism? We don't know. Like, there's not a founder of Vedic Brahmanism. The three of the major religions in the world, Christianity, rabbinical Judaism, like post Second Temple Judaism, and Islam, all come from the Israelite religion of the ancient Near East. Who founded that? There's plenty of idiosyncrasies in that we can't just attribute to something, right? And Bronkhorst in Greater Magda, if you've read that book, has made a very compelling case that Buddhism influenced the development of humanism is this trade of ideas, this back and forth. So at some point, to me, it's just as plausible that there was a parting of the ways somewhere between the shamanic traditions of Buddhism and Jainism that didn't necessarily have to be originated from one dude, right? Like, you don't have to have a smart man to come up with some of these ideas. And the more you distill the ideas, you see that they're not that different from each other, right? So that takes us to our archaeological evidence, right? Ashoka was a ruler in the Mauryan dynasty, grandson of Chandragupta, and basically the legend has it, after the Kalinga Wars, he felt really bad about killing a bunch of people, so he converted to Buddhism. That sounds an awful lot like Jainism to me. He's very much on the ahimsa side of things, but that's neither here or there. So there's a bunch of edicts where he mentions Dhamma, which is Pali for Dharma. He doesn't necessarily specifically mention the Buddha, and even scholars who like accept the historicity of the Buddha, which is pretty much everybody, argue that by Dhamma, Ashoka didn't necessarily mean Buddhism, right? There's a conflation there that happens in the scholastic community that's not always there. There's only 2 of these inscriptions that we have that actually mention a Buddha, a person. This is somewhat analogous to like the letters of Paul, if you're familiar with the Christian thing. He doesn't really talk about an earthly Jesus. He might kind of maybe mention his brother, but that could also be other things. Like, we just don't have a lot of biographical details other than the Buddha Charta, which is like the 5th century or something like that. So we've got in Lumbini, that should be a long I, sorry, the birthplace of the Buddha. There's a pillar that basically says he was born here. Cool. And then the Bharat Calcutta temple, you've all seen the pictures of it. It's the circular one where Ashoka or whoever the scribe was mentioned certain texts, right? The Lumbini temple, the Lumbini pillar, it's problematic because it does mention Shakyamuni, right? And this is where my Sanskrit might get me into trouble. So I looked it up. Beckwith makes a compelling point for this. I'm not sure about his like Pyrrhic theories on the Buddha, the other stuff, but in the appendix of that book, he tucks some very interesting arguments about this stuff. Everything else is in Pali. Shakyamuni with the Y is Sanskrit. Where is that Sanskrit coming from? Right? It's not necessarily plausible. If we have 28 other inscriptions that are completely in Pali, why is this one Shakyamuni instead of the Pali Shakyamuni there? Like that's problematic. I mean, you could just look at the script. That looks newer than that. The guy who discovered this was seen as a forger. So there's a lot of historical problems with these. So when I assign these numbers, and again, these numbers are just kind of whatever. Let me see if I can get this out of the way. I put that we kind of have a 1-to-1 chance, and these are odds, not fractions, by the way. So for every occurrence of a, forged, essentially, as this could be, pillar in real life, for a real person, we have an occurrence of one of a mythical person, right? Like, I don't think that's too far off. Again, if you want to crunch these numbers and come up with your own, by all means, that's what this is here for. And the other one, so there's some texts that are mentioned in the Bharat temple that weren't written until years after Ashoka. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. Like, scholars could have the names of the text wrong. Like, we're assuming that by XYZ title, they mean XYZ text. We could just be wrong about that, and they could be totally different, right? But as it stands, there hasn't really been done a full, like, actual historical analysis on these things. We just accept them at face value. And that's where Bayes theorem really comes in here. Like, can we really trust ourselves on this? And at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily matter. I'm not trying to challenge Buddhism as a way of thought. I'm not challenging Christianity as a way of thought. Like, it's just the empirical approach is very interesting to me. So the last thing we have, the Pipperha relics, in this little pot, there's gems and bones, right? That date from the 3rd to the 2nd century BCE. They supposedly contain the bones of the Buddha because that's what that says on the thing in Brahmi script and Pali. Now, the authenticity is questioned but accepted. But the biggest thing here is, if we accept a lifetime of the Buddha around 450 BCE, this is 100 to 200 years after that, right? We cannot emphatically say that, oh yeah, here they are. There's a lot that can happen in those 1 to 200 years where someone would just put bones in a pot and say we're the bones of the Buddha, right? Like, maybe with other things, yeah, sure, great. If this were one of a million relics we have, but we don't. And we have relics for other figures. There's relics of Jesus. And they have significant theological and spiritual value to people. I'm not demeaning that. I'm just saying that just because the Shroud of Turin is a thing doesn't mean Jesus existed. Doesn't mean he doesn't exist. It just means we can't use it as evidence, right? So this, I scored, again, a fortiori being as generous as possible. From what I've read and what I've experienced and what I've researched, if Ashoka venerated the Buddha as much as he claims to have, as much as scholars claim to have, I would think the bones of the Buddha, his birthplace, would be much more celebrated, much more taken care of. There would be much more surrounding this than this kind of afterthought, essentially, of a pot. Now, I could be wrong. We could find more evidence that says it was much more celebrated, got moved around, it got stolen. There's plenty of things that could happen, but I gave it 1-to-1 odds, a fortiori, saying essentially we can't count it. And then I gave it 2-to-1 odds, saying that's twice as more likely on a hypothesis of myth than it is of history, right? And again, those are my numbers. It would take a doctorate dissertation and people with way more knowledge of my stuff to assign accurate numbers here. I'm just doing it for the math so we can kind of see it. So anyway, here's more math. What this comes up with is a fortiori, the evidence that we have saying, and again, remember, this is assuming that like Theseus was real, that he really killed that Minotaur. We have 52.4% chance of, if 100 figures existed, right? And all of this evidence came up for 100 of those figures, about half of them would be real. That's not bad for antiquity. It's really not. It sounds like I'm trying to like explode the consensus here. 52.4% in antiquity is pretty good. Adjudicatiori, and again, which is a little bit closer to what I think is going on, we have about a 2.5% chance, right? A probability, saying that with all of the circumstances that were given, anybody 2.5 times out of 100, they would actually be a historical character. So what does this mean, right? Then this is where the part 2 will come in. And I guess this means I have to get another degree somewhere and finish this. But basically the text that we have on Mahavira, you think we don't have a lot for the Buddha? We have way less for Mahavira. I had to comb through, and Alexis had to comb through a lot to to find me stuff. And I found in Heinz Beckert in the conference in the 80s where they agreed on the Buddha's birth date. There's a text here, it's from the Pali Canon, and it's basically the Buddha is not, they never interact in the literature. Buddha and Mahavira never actually interact. They never meet each other. They're not buddies, but Buddha talks to disciples of Mahavira. So what that tells us, and again, this is like 3 paragraphs of one text that's a quadrillion years, not a quadrillion, it's like 2,000 years old. But like, so again, that's a lot of ifs. But so we can assume that Jainism is a little bit older than Buddhism from this. And the other thing is, the significance of the Buddha's death date for the review of the origins of Jainism cannot be overestimated, exactly because the roots of Jainism are much more obscure than those of Buddhism. That's from the Conference of the Dating of the Buddha. What does that mean? That means that if we think that there's a plausibility that the Buddha wasn't historical, we have to start over, right? Because these dates are linked to the Buddha's dates, which are linked to Alexander the Great, right? So to me, that's where the value in this is. It has nothing to do with what I think of the theology, what I think of the spirituality. Like, I don't necessarily think that the Buddha may be eating a tainted pork chop or a poisonous mushroom, however some sects say he died. To me, that's all personal theology, and that's up to you or any individual practitioner. However, from a historical critical standpoint, I think it's important to look at the hard stuff. I think it's important to question these things. I think it's important to challenge what we think in an empirical thought, because, and I think I'm in good company here, but we can't make fun of people who deny climate change and say they don't think empirically if we're not going to think empirically when it comes to this stuff, right? And so if I've offended anybody by saying the Buddha might not be real, one of 2 things: if you really need the Buddha to be real, you should really, really look into this. And just know that I'm not trying to like invalidate any sort of theology, whether it's Christian, Buddhist, anything like that. I'm just trying to empirically look at what we have. And through all this, we come across with more stuff. Like, through the reading about the historicity of Jesus, I've learned more about Hellenistic Roman culture, completely unrelated to the Judeo-Christian theology. And it's just cool. It's just interesting. So that's what I have with that. The future research considerations, to borrow a term from biblical studies, we would look for a parting of the ways between Buddhism and Jainism. Because if you read the texts, a lot of times Buddhism and Jainism is like one thing. It's a compound, if you will, to borrow from Sanskrit, right? Only later does it start to split. So what are we looking at here? And then we obviously need more research on the Ashokan edicts. Guy Beckwith gives a very snarky assessment of it in his book about the Greek Buddha. But he hit some points. He hit some linguistic considerations. He hit some epigraphical considerations. The chain of custody and the evidence isn't very good. So anyway, that's what I have with that. I hope I didn't bore you guys too much, but yeah, so we might have a Buddha, we might not. So.